When you picture a medieval queen, do you imagine a graceful lady on a throne? Think again. The truth is far more disgusting than you'd ever expect. You see, queens may have had castles, jewels and servants, but hygiene was a different story. Some queens were said to bathe only once or twice a year. Instead of cleaning themselves, they drenched their bodies in perfumes to mask the stench. Medicine wasn't any better. Medieval queens sometimes drank revolting potions made from rotten animal parts, believing it would heal them. Imagine being surrounded by silk and gold, yet smelling worse than a farmer in the fields. And it wasn't just about smell. Bad teeth, lice infestations, and unwashed clothes were common even among royalty. Behind the throne, these queens lived lives far more disgusting than history likes to admit. We're uncovering the dirty secrets of queens most people never hear about. If you enjoy exploring the strange and hidden sides of history, please like and subscribe. It helps us dig deeper and bring you even more mysterious stories from the past. The filthy truth about medieval queens. When you imagine a medieval queen, the picture that comes to mind is probably something straight out of a fairy tale. A woman dressed in velvet and gold, seated on a jeweled throne, perfumed, graceful, and admired by all. We're taught to think of queens as symbols of elegance, power, and refinement. But the reality? Well, it's far filthier than you might dare to imagine. Forget the polished portraits and Disney crowns. The truth is that many medieval queens lived in ways that would horrify us today. They were not immune to the dirt, disease, and downright disgusting habits of their time. In fact, they were sometimes worse. And once you hear what royalty really meant behind the glamour, you might never look at a crown the same way again. The illusion of royal cleanliness. Let's start with the most obvious question. Did medieval queens ever bathe? The shocking answer is rarely. In an age where even peasants had to haul buckets of water and heat it by fire just to wash, bathing was not an everyday habit for anyone. But royalty, including queens, often believed that water itself was dangerous. Doctors of the time warned that water could open the pores and let in disease. So instead of washing, queens relied on perfumes, scented oils, and powders to mask their odor. Imagine silk gowns and golden crowns, but beneath them, skin that hadn't seen soap for weeks, maybe even months. Some sources suggest certain queens might bathe only a few times a year. Yes, you heard that right, once or twice annually. One chronicle even notes that French royalty would plan ceremonial baths almost like festivals, because they happened so rarely. So while you might picture a glowing, fragrant queen, the reality was someone whose perfume was working overtime to cover a stench you could smell across the hall. Now pause for a second and imagine standing in a great medieval hall. The tapestries are rich, the tables heavy with food. The queen enters, and everyone bows. But as she walks by, the air is thick with musk, sweat, and the sweet but overwhelming scent of rose water desperately masking the truth. Still feel regal? When luxury meets lice, and it wasn't just about bathing. Queens, despite their crowns, were plagued by some of the same problems as commoners: lice, fleas, and vermin. Court documents and personal letters mention servants picking lice out of noble women's hair as a regular task. Combs carved from ivory weren't for styling. They were lice combs. Even the queen, seated in luxury, might scratch at her scalp beneath a golden headdress, while a lady-in-waiting discreetly tried to catch the pests crawling through her locks. Think about that image for a second. The symbol of grace holding court among nobles and ambassadors, while tiny insects feasted on her scalp. And what about her clothing? The gowns, often made of heavy fabrics like velvet and brocade, were almost never washed. Washing ruined expensive cloth. Instead, gowns were aired out or brushed, but the grime, sweat, and body oil stayed trapped in the fibers. Queens could change outfits often, yes, but that didn't mean they were clean. They simply layered perfume and linen shifts underneath, hoping to absorb some of the sweat. Imagine a closet filled with gowns worth more than a farmer's lifetime earnings, but each one carrying the ghost of yesterday's odor. A diet for rotten teeth. Now, let's talk about something that might make you wince. Their teeth. Medieval queens didn't have the sparkling white smiles we imagine. In fact, many had blackened or rotting teeth, caused by diets rich in sugar, especially as sugar became more available through trade. Catherine of Valois, a 15th century queen of England, was said to suffer badly from dental decay. Chroniclers noted that even her breath carried a stench. Imagine being a monarch who could order banquets of honey, candied fruits, and sweet wine, but at the cost of your mouth slowly rotting. Dentistry was primitive. Extractions were brutal, performed with metal pliers, and infection was a constant risk. Queens endured toothaches, abscesses, and swollen gums, often treated with bizarre remedies, like rubbing crushed herbs or vinegar on the gums. None of it worked for long. And here's the cruel irony. Peasants, who rarely had access to sugar, often had stronger, healthier teeth than their monarchs. The richest women in the land sometimes had the worst smiles. Disgusting medieval medicine. If you think rotten teeth and lice are bad, wait until you hear what queens endured in the name of medicine. The medieval world believed in remedies that today would make us gag. A queen with a fever might be prescribed a potion made of ground-up worms, rotten animal parts, or even powdered mummies stolen from Egyptian tombs. Some treatments included drinking urine therapy, believed to cleanse the body. Others smeared animal dung on wounds to draw out evil spirits. And yes, queens, with all their jewels and finery, swallowed these remedies because the court, physicians told them it would save their lives. One account from France describes a queen being treated for a fever by being bled with leeches, fed ground liver, and forced to drink a concoction so foul the servants had to hold their noses. All this in a room filled with incense and prayers, while outside the peasants probably thought their monarch lived in pure luxury, castles of stench. Now, you might think at least queens lived in grand, clean castles, but medieval castles were anything but clean. They were drafty, smoky, and above all, smelly. Toilets? Forget modern bathrooms. Queens often used chamber pots, just like everyone else. Servants would empty them into cesspits, or sometimes straight out of castle windows. Entire courtyards reeked of waste. Some castles had garderobes, holes in the wall that dropped straight into the moat. But the stench? Unbearable. So picture a queen in her chambers. She's draped in silk, wearing jewels worth a fortune. But the corner of her room holds a chamber pot, and the air smells faintly of waste, smoke from the hearth, and the sour odor of unwashed clothes. Does this sound like a fairy tale, or more like a nightmare? The reality behind the glamour. All of this builds a very different picture of medieval queens. Instead of flawless beauty and elegance, we see human women trapped in the filth of their age, battling life, rotting teeth, disgusting medicine, and the stink of unwashed castles. And here's the twist. Queens weren't just victims of their time. Sometimes they embraced the filth. A pale, unwashed face was even considered fashionable in some courts. It showed that a woman didn't need to labor outdoors. White, greasy skin was a status symbol, so the very dirt that horrified peasants might have been flaunted as beauty by queens. Isn't it strange? The things we now call disgusting were once marks of power and luxury. A question for you. So let me ask you, would you trade places with a medieval queen? Power, jewels, castles, respect, but at the price of bathing once a year, teeth rotting in your mouth, and lice crawling in your crown? History loves to polish its portraits, but behind every painted smile, there are the smells, sights, and secrets that tell the real story. And this is only the beginning of the filthy truth. Because if queens lived like this, imagine what their private lives, daily routines, and medical secrets reveal when we dig even deeper. The shocking, revolting, and fascinating reality of medieval queens goes far beyond what we've uncovered here. Stay with me, because the next part will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about royalty. We left off with a disturbing picture. Queens living in castles that smelled of waste, wearing gowns never washed, and masking their bodies with perfume rather than soap. But believe it or not, that was just the surface. The deeper you look into the private lives of these women, the stranger, more revolting, and more fascinating it becomes. Because queens weren't just figureheads of elegance. They were mothers, wives, and patients in an era where childbirth was deadly, medicine was grotesque, and beauty came with a cost that would make us cringe today. Childbirth, a royal nightmare. If you were a medieval queen, one of your most important duties was to produce heirs. But childbirth in the Middle Ages was anything but glamorous. Imagine being heavily pregnant in a smoky castle chamber, surrounded not by sterile doctors, but by midwives using charms, prayers, and sometimes downright terrifying remedies. Pain relief? Forget it. Instead, queens clutched relics, drank herbal brews, or even placed amulets under their pillows, hoping for divine protection. Yet even with wealth, queens died in childbirth at alarming rates. The dangers of infection, hemorrhage, and poor hygiene meant that giving birth could be fatal. And because a queen's womb was tied to the kingdom's future, the pressure was immense. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, endured multiple stillbirths and miscarriages. Others were forced to undergo painful, invasive procedures with little chance of success. One French queen reportedly drank potions made from ground pearls, mixed with wine to strengthen her child. Another was smeared with strange ointments to ease labor, but ended up with infections that hastened her death. And after delivery, The so-called lying-in period often involved the queen being sealed, away in a dark room for weeks, breathing stale air with barely any washing allowed. Can you imagine? Giving birth in filth, then recovering in even more filth, while the kingdom celebrated a new heir, beauty secrets that will make you shudder. But let's step back from childbirth for a moment. How did queens maintain their beauty, or at least try to? Here's where things get even more disgusting. Pale skin was the ultimate sign of nobility. It meant you didn't work in the fields. So queens used all sorts of concoctions to keep their faces white and smooth. The most common ingredient? Lead. Yes, toxic lead mixed into creams and powders. Queens would paint their faces with lead-based makeup, slowly poisoning themselves. Some even used mixtures containing mercury to remove blemishes, which only damaged their skin further. Over time, their faces could become blotchy, scarred and sickly pale, but in court, this was considered beautiful. For hair, queens sometimes used urine as a bleaching agent. Letters and recipes from the time mention rinsing hair in stale urine to make it lighter. Imagine the smell in a court where every lady in waiting carried jars of the stuff to help her mistress stay fashionable. And perfume? It wasn't the delicate floral notes we think of today. Medieval perfumes were heavy, musky, and overpowering, designed to fight the reek of unwashed bodies. A queen's chamber might reek not only of roses and cloves, but of sweat, damp wool, and whatever herbs were smoldering in the brazier to keep away pests. Medicine or madness? If medieval beauty sounds bad, medicine was worse. We touched on potions of rotten meat and dung, but queens also endured treatments that sound like pure torture. Leeching was common. A fever? Apply leeches. A headache? Bloodletting. Some queens had their veins opened multiple times in a single week. The loss of blood often made them weaker, not stronger. Other cures involved burning herbs that filled chambers with choking smoke. Some queens were told to sleep with the corpses of animals, believing the life force would transfer to them. One chronicler even mentions a queen being advised to drink a draught mixed with ground emeralds, which of course destroyed her insides. And because queens had access to exotic imports, their remedies could be more dangerous than the peasants. Powdered pearls, mercury, arsenic, the richer the cure, the deadlier it often was. Scandalous eating and drinking habits. Now, let's step into the royal dining hall. Queens were expected to eat in public, setting an example of refinement. But refinement didn't mean cleanliness. Meals stretched on for hours. Imagine heavy meats, greasy stews, mountains of bread, all eaten with hands more often than utensils. Forks were considered strange or even sinful in many places. A queen might delicately tear into roast swan with her fingers, then wipe them on the tablecloth. And the drinking? Water was considered unsafe, so wine and ale were consumed constantly. Queens were often half drunk by the end of feasts. Some were notorious for overindulging, leading to bloated bodies, foul breath, and even gout. One chronicler mocked a queen for having a belly swollen like a wineskin from her indulgences. Another queen was accused of gluttony, so severe that she couldn't walk far without resting. So while peasants drank thin beer to stay alive, queens gorged themselves on rich foods, and their bodies bore the consequences. Rotten teeth, obesity, and digestive issues plagued many royal women. Hidden scandals and private filth. Of course, behind closed doors, queens weren't just symbols of piety and power. They were human beings with private scandals, some of them surprisingly filthy. Letters from servants describe messy chambers, stained sheets, and neglected hygiene. One queen of Castile was accused of refusing to wash for weeks, even while entertaining foreign ambassadors. Another was whispered to have bad breath so terrible courtiers avoided kissing her hand. And then there were affairs. Queens were expected to be virtuous, but many had secret lovers. Private encounters often took place in drafty chambers with little privacy and no sanitation. Can you imagine the smells, the setting, the reality behind what ballads later painted as romance? Even their menstruation was treated with bizarre superstition. Queens were sometimes secluded during their monthly cycles, considered unclean. Remedies for cramps included charms, prayers, and strange brews of herbs that rarely worked. Yet these moments, hushed and hidden, reveal the humanity of queens more than any crown ever could.